Thank you very much. My name is Tim Judah. I'm the Balkans correspondent of The Economist. And in the past, I've been in this region. And in the last few years, I actually spent quite a lot of time in Ukraine. And I just wanted to make a reference to something that somebody said before, which was to use the Putin's comparison of Crimea and to talk about Kosovo. I would just like to say one word. It's Srebrenica. Sorry. This comparison is completely invalid, and we can talk about that later. But the Kosovo War did not come out of it was not just something that happened, it was part of a long continuum, and Srebrenica was one of the most important factors which led to 1999. Okay, I've just now got that off my chest. I've been wondering how to address this topic, because in general, I've found that people from the Balkans and people who know about the Balkans tend to know not very much about this region and vice versa. And sometimes we see comparisons, for example, in ethnic conflict, majorities versus minorities and so on, but in the end they do tend to be quite superficial. The other day I saw on the corner of Yerevan Street in Podgorica, which is the capital of Montenegro, a very strange graffiti, at least for the Balkans. It said, Nagorno-Karabakh is Armenia. I was puzzled, and I asked all my Montenegrin friends what this meant, since I can say with some confidence that 99% of people in Podgorica have no idea where Nagorno-Karabakh is. And I said, is this some sort of kind of clever, how should I put it, is it some sort of clever local gang thing? Maybe the Yerevan Street gang have identified, have called some part of their turf Nagorno-Karabakh. And I was told, no, I'm afraid you're looking for something that's just not there. It's basically a joke, albeit a rather sophisticated joke, poking fun at the region's own equivalent graffiti, which is Kosovo is Serbia. So the point is that while we might like to see comparisons, in the end, I think they're mostly only in the eye of the beholder. And I'm not sure that, that there are many that can be usefully made, such that we can draw lessons from anyway. Well, if I'm not going to draw similarities, then let's talk about the biggest difference. And I want to do that with making a point which may seem like a cliche, and it is a cliche, but just because it's a cliche doesn't mean it's not true. I'm sorry, geography is destiny. Here, as we've heard in the previous discussions, Russia and Turkey loom over absolutely everything, unavoidable by sheer size alone. Not only is there no Balkan Russia, I'm putting it in inverted commas, or Turkey in the same way as there is here, but the whole region now is surrounded by the EU and NATO. And in many respects, even if not in terms of formal membership for some of the countries, it's being absorbed by both. A quick parenthesis, though. I think that I need to explain a couple of things that would never need to be explained in the Balkans, but I suspect they do here, as terminologies do tend to be important. This occurred to me the other day. I was chairing a panel in Montenegro, and an analyst from Russia made a passing reference to the collapse she said, of two empires. First, I expect everybody, like I think everybody else there, was wondering what on earth she was talking about. And then I realized that she was looking at the Balkans from this part of the world. She was comparing the USSR with Russia at its core to Yugoslavia and Serbia. But I just think, no, that doesn't work. Yugoslavia was many things, but it wasn't an empire. You can't make that comparison. Secondly, I want to make another point about terminology. I'm using the word Balkans loosely because that's what I was asked to do, but I'm actually really talking about the Western Balkans, and it's important to point out this is in fact, in terms of geopolitics, a new term. It just didn't exist 25 years ago. So what does it mean? It means very specifically ex-Yugoslavia minus Slovenia plus Albania. So before I came, I was given a few questions to tackle. And one of them first was, what were the expectations after the collapse of communism? Well, okay, let's just leave Albania out of this. It's an outlier here. In the former Yugoslavia, I don't think anyone really had much time for expectations, really, unless they were dedicated to creating a greater Serbia or greater Croatia and so on. Also, communism, as opposed to Yugoslavia as a state, did not so much as collapse like here, but communism light, as they had it, just kind of fizzled out. And as it did, euphoria and nationalism engulfed the region, to be followed by the wars as the lunatics took over the asylum. No one really thought to think of what they could lose because, well, who does in such a situation? Yugoslavia had many faults, but its people were comparatively wealthy. They could travel, unlike Hungarians or Romanians or people here. And what more, they could travel visa-free to pretty much the whole world, east and west. And they could, and they did, work abroad. A quarter of a century later, it's hard to say that people have recovered everything that they've lost. And certainly many don't believe that they've done so, though what they believe tends to correlate to where they come from. The collapse of Yugoslavia and the period of the wars rolled out over more or less a decade. By the time it was over, so much had been lost, so much had been destroyed, so many had left, that most of the region had slipped so far behind that even today it's still trying to catch up. But back to geography, the Kosovo War, which I mentioned, of 1999, was key, and the NATO intervention, which was mentioned before, because it propelled Bulgaria and Romania into NATO, and sooner rather than later, I want to say, the EU. Slovenia joined the EU, Slovenia joined NATO too in 2004. So we then had, I mean, just look at the maps, we had literally a backyard. The whole of this Western Balkan region surrounded by NATO and increasingly the EU. Today, Croatia, Albania are also in NATO, and in less than 2 weeks, on June the 5th, Montenegro will join as well. Croatia is also in the EU, and Croatia is also in the EU. So, having to sort of define this geographical thing, I want to point to something else, this question about the end of transition. And as people have said, it's very hard to define what is the end of transition. How do you know when it ends? Because, for example, let me make a comparison. If you go from an EU country like Croatia, you go to Serbia, it doesn't really feel like there's much different, or Serbia to the European Union, to EU Bulgaria, let's say. But for the sake of argument, let's say that joining these two clubs, especially the EU, does mean that you've passed certain yardsticks, that you've adopted 10,000 things you're supposed to do to make you a modern European state. Well, we can debate whether that's true or not. But just let's use that as some sort of yardstick for this idea of an end of transition, because it's a way of kind of measuring it. It's a way of defining that's the end of at least one chapter and moving to the next. So now, what do we have? We have a new term that has emerged with the Western Balkans 6. These are the 6 countries which remain to enter the EU: Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Albania, and Montenegro. And they're all still in transition at various stages of the EU accession path. And here's the key thing that makes these countries so different from here and all of the former Soviet states, bar the Baltics, of course. In 2003, the EU made a specific, very clear promise, which in Thessalonica, to wit, that if all these countries did their homework, they would all join when they were ready. Well, we can discuss the hows and the whens and if this is still serious, but the fact is that this is what gives these countries a direction of travel. Everyone knows what they have to do. It's all written down in black and white, and there is a goal. As I say, you can say, well, was that goal the end of transition or not? But it's something measurable. So what's happening? There are 2 levels to this question, i.e. what's happening domestically in each country and then regionally. Let's start with the latter, not least because it makes an interesting counterpoint to here. If you follow the news about the region, you'll read about unfinished business, the war that continues in people's heads in a dysfunctional Bosnia, ill-tempered spats between Kosovo and Serbia and Croatia, in which they row about things like who did what in the Second World War, etc., etc. But the far more interesting stuff is the boring stuff. In the former Yugoslavia, the building of links across the region, or rebuilding of links across the region, I should say, has continued apace with constant rounds of meetings every week between everyone from leaders, ministers, policemen, professionals, and so on. People travel easily. Croatian, Slovene companies invest in Bosnia and Serbia, and so on, because it's also long been understood that each country is just far too small for many businesses, either foreign or local, or at least too small for them to prosper if they want to grow. But that's where what we call the Yugosphere comes into comes into play. An area not of 1 million, 1.5 million people here, 3 million people here, 2 million here, but 20 to 22 million. And there the dynamics are entirely different. And don't forget, another difference perhaps with this region is these are countries which pretend to speak different languages officially, Bosnia, Serbian, Croatian, and Montenegrin, but in fact their languages are as different as English and American, Australian, or New Zealandish. And I think that's a sort of crucial thing which binds these countries together to a certain extent. And another thing, perhaps it's psychological, but no one really regards the other countries of the former Yugoslavia as really abroad, as in the same way as they would Bulgaria or Austria, say. Meanwhile, to the south, we have something else emerging. Kosovo, it's part of the Yugosphere, but it's also part of an emerging Albanian sphere, a region where people have been completely separated for decades by politics and mountains, and are now coming together in a region which is also being knitted together by media, entertainment, and new roads. Okay, despite these links, however, trade between the countries remains feeble. Only 20% of exports and 10% of imports are between them. But still, an incomplete free trade area exists, and while countries make slow progress towards the EU, in many respects they are already being absorbed as they adopt EU standards. An energy community linked to the EU exists, a treaty integrating transport policy and aligning it to the EU is ready for signing. Work's already been done on mutual recognition of professional qualifications. Now there are discussions on how to pull this all together under one umbrella or Western Balkan Common Market and to fill the gaps. Domestically, though, are new states emerging, and this is perhaps where I should having said that there were not so many comparisons, having been listening to what people have been saying this afternoon, perhaps there are more than I should have taken more into consideration. In the decade after the wars, we could say that there was serious progress towards making modern states, but now we're much less sure. In the Western Balkan 6, there's a new buzzword which has been adopted, which is stabilitocracies. Democracy has been backsliding for a decade, as a paper written recently on the subject. Autocrats of the Western Balkan states rule through informal power structures, state capture by ruling parties, patronage, and control of the media. And it goes on. This decline did not happen by stealth, but was ignored or downplayed by the European Union and the United States for too long. In other words, you keep the region stable, keep your nationalists and warmongers in check, don't cause problems for us, and in exchange we'll cast a blind eye to your authoritarian and kleptocratic tendencies and the overlap of politics, business, and organised crime. And yet, the problem is that no sooner have you got a sexy theory or an alarming development that finally everyone is beginning to take seriously and the facts move on, but everything's connected. For example, last week we saw ongoing political problems which have been going on for ages, suddenly resolved, magically resolved in Macedonia and Albania in the wake of a visit by a senior State Department official. But was he coming because he was worried about them in particular? Well, no, but it seems that the US, which disengaged from the region after the wars, is now heeding pleas to re-engage, not least because EU clout has been declining and the Russian influence in the media and politics has increased. Russia is even alleged to have been in some way involved in a plot to overthrow the government of Montenegro last year in a bid to stop its NATO accession. So things are shifting here. Russia had hoped to secure a bloc of 4 neutral states, Montenegro, Serbia, Macedonia, and Bosnia. But just as the Western media begins to wake up to the issue, it seems that peak Russia might have been passed in the Balkans. But this increased engagement also means that the US and Germany too are beginning to tire of autocrats who promise stability in exchange for being left alone to steal quietly and to do what they like. Macedonia is the perfect case in point. In constant crisis for more than 2 years, Nikola Gruevski, the man who presented himself as the most pro-Western of leaders, has found his authority eroded and began to play the most dangerous nationalist card in a bid to retain power, probably in a bid to evade arrest too, and the country became ever more unstable. Balkan leaders, thanks to their geographic position, are often expert at being tails, wagging the dogs, extracting the maximum from whoever they can. But they can only do this for so long before the dogs get irritated, and I have a feeling that's exactly what's happening now. But there can also be, and there can also be, a certain amount of dissimulation. Amongst Serbs, for example, bitterness for the bombing of 1999, and often a complete denial of what might have led up to it, runs deep. So Serbia is not on a track to join NATO. And 3 times a year, when Russia and the Serbs do some military exercise together, this is front-page news, and this keeps that part of the electorate happy. But the reality is that Serbia, militarily the key state in the region, does more than 100 military engagements of one big or small, of one kind or another, with NATO or NATO countries every year. So you can see what I mean by dissimulation and how Aleksandar Vučić, Serbia's Prime Minister and President-elect, has managed to get away with it, thus far at least, degrading the country's democracy while delivering elsewhere. So to sum up, comparisons, at least in the geopolitical context, I think are skin deep. Historical experience of the former Yugoslavia and Albania means that while there are, in one sense, on Europe's periphery, like here, the fact that geographically they are not makes all the difference. The migrant crisis, which saw hundreds of thousands troop through in 2015 and 2016, meant their cooperation was essential in stopping it, is a case in point. The fact that if Russia can hive off this area, or rather the orthodox parts, and make them neutral or pro-Russian, right in the middle of EU and NATO territory, makes all the difference. Now the future of the region is completely linked to the fate of the rest of Europe. If the EU prospers, the region whose economies rise and fall with that of Central Europe, Italy and Germany especially, will prosper. If the EU begins to fall apart, then all bets are off for the Western Balkans. So to reiterate, for here, for there, geography is destiny.